Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video I'll be doing a review of the second season of the challenge, All Stars, which did end up giving me more of what I loved from the first season, while also fixing some of the issues I had with that season, while also bringing a lot of great drama and gameplay along the way that I felt like was missing from that first season. Now, with that being said, the show isn't perfect. I do think the episodes are overall too short, and I do feel like we didn't get enough scenes from within the house itself, and also just the overall episode count is less than my ideal. But when my main issues are how little of the show I am getting, I do feel like that is one of the better issues to have, and is really the complete opposite issue I have with the main series, which I think has been increasingly more bloated and has a lack of interesting drama and gameplay. So for me, All Stars 2 here was a breath of fresh air here, and ends up being a pretty strong season of the show. But to run through why, I will be talking about the season episode by episode. So let's start that off with the premiere, which was a bit of a strange episode, as it didn't end with elimination, which did feel very underwhelming initially, especially, again, coming from a show that's on a streaming service. I don't know why they're putting such a limitation on the length of the episodes, where like every episode here is put together as if it's like an hour-long televised episode, which again is very underwhelming, as I do feel like we're missing out on a good chunk of content because of that. And really, the structuring of this first episode did make it feel mostly uneventful, with the game not really kicking off until the next episode. Though something this episode does do very well is reintroducing its cast, with everyone getting content in this first episode. Now, obviously, some people got bigger intros than others, and there were some people here and there that didn't get any real personal content here, though they would in future episodes. But overall, I did like how everyone on the cast got their time to speak here, particularly the ones that we haven't seen in a while. I mean, we first get introduced to Tina, who to me was the biggest get for this cast here. I mean, I've always loved Tina as a character on the older seasons, and she really proved here that she hasn't really missed a beat, with her still giving amazing confessionals and her really making a massive first impression here, to the point where there's plenty of talk about how loud and annoying she is, and even TJ ends up calling her loudmouth. But beyond that, it's also cool to see people like Jasmine, Tyler, and Jody back as well, who had not been on the main show in a while, with Jasmine in particular coming off as a radically different person, now being this like nice motherly figure, despite her originally being this very confrontational figure back in her original run. We did also have some surprises of people that I had no clue who they were coming into this season, considering I hadn't watched the first 9 seasons when this season started. So there were people like Steve, who again, didn't know, but he instantly became a pretty fun character here, of him talking about his hand modeling, and we got the setup of his relationship with Katie. Ayanna gets a really positive intro here that did make her feel really likable, despite the fact that her likability gets a bit rocky moving forward. We also get so many redemption arcs set up here, with most of them not really going anywhere. I mean, particularly Katie's, who says last time was a vacation, but this time she's actually going to try, which, again, doesn't hold up. But people like Kaia, Teck, and Melinda do end up getting similar content here, but do end up sticking true to their arcs a bit more. Janelle gets a strong intro here as well, where she instantly gets to talk about her strategy coming into the season, with her talking about playing the social game and talking about how to manage relationships, how to manage Tina, which again was strong game content from her, and along with the fact that we instantly see her relationship with Derrick and Jasmine from her real world season, it did make it feel like she was going to be a big contender on this season. Now, Derrick Chavez was another person that I felt like was a big question mark coming into this season. I really was questioning why he was even cast here, but he ended up being a lot more fun than I was expecting. I did find him to be very likable here. I did also like seeing the secret alliance between Darrell and Janelle that obviously ends up being important by the end game. I did like seeing Derrick and Jody pick up where they left off, them being really close back in the day. But really, a lot of the early season of the show here does revolve around this rivalry between Derrick and Nehemiah, which did feel like a really forced rivalry here, with both of them really hamming it up for the camera and really making it seem like they were playing this up to eventually get on like a rival season down the road, but it did lead to some fun dynamics moving forward with them being the leaders of the two sides of the house that did end up boosting the gameplay of this season. But then we do get to the first daily where we do learn the format of the season, which I do think was mostly really good. I mean, we do have a similar changing format as last time where some challenges are done in teams, some in duos, some as individuals, where each challenge will have a male and female winner and loser. The losers instantly go into elimination, while the winners will nominate 2 men and 2 women that the remaining players will vote on to see who goes against the loser, which to me is a really strong format. I always like the bottom placing person in the daily going into elimination, as it increases the chances of someone in the majority going in, while also having the 2 winners having to agree on who to nominate, also increasing the chances that the majority does not get its way. I do also like the element of the remaining players getting to vote, as again it adds a more social strategy element to the game as well, just inherently with the concept of their votes, but also with the fact that the winners have to think about who's going to be voted out with their potential set of noms. So again, I did like this initial format, and it just gets even better after the addition of the life shield as well. I mean, the daily itself here was kind of lame though, where the pairs have to traverse through 2 boats and then throw a skull into a basket, and this just felt very cheap and was also just kind of boring. And annoyingly, they do play up the old people thing again, which again is still ridiculous when most of this cast is not that old. I mean, particularly like Ryan and Jasmine, the 2 people that were getting mocked here, despite the fact that again, like Jasmine's one of the younger people on this cast. But Ayanna ends up falling off the beam, making her and Nehemiah the losers, as long as everyone else ends up crossing the beam, and because of that, the remaining teams end up going super cautiously, which upsets TJ because it's TJ. But I really hate how they like act like this is the reason why we're getting double eliminations moving forward, which again is really dumb considering obviously this is pre-planned. Like obviously that was already the plan coming into this. But really in general, I really hate how much the production team tries to act like TJ has the power over things when it's very clearly the producers behind the scenes that are the people deciding these things. But again, whatever, who cares? But to be fair, this is something they've been doing for years on the show. But with this challenge here, Derrick and Jody end up winning it, setting themselves up as the top dogs early on here, and again really propelling this Derrick-Nehemiah rivalry, while also setting up this Jody-Tino rivalry, which ends up playing a factor moving forward as well. And awkwardly, we do see them return to the house, only for the episode to abruptly end afterwards, which really comes out of left field for me and left me just wanting more here. But thankfully, the next episode didn't disappoint, and with that, let's jump into episode 2, where we instantly see Derrick and Jody going around the house trying to figure out their noms, which again progresses Derrick's rivalry with Nehemiah after he tells Derrick that he wants to take out Ryan. But Derrick ends up neglecting this suggestion and instead nominates Derrick C and bizarrely Steve, which seems to stem from this weird segment where Steve mocks Derrick's clothing, which, I mean, was bad social play on Steve's end, but also seemed very petty of Derrick to be targeting him because of that. As for the women, it did seem like Leia was the easy target there, and they end up using Casey as a pawn. And while that part of their plan does end up going through, I did like to see Derrick not get his way with him targeting Steve, with Steve being saved over Derrick C, which was kind of humorous to see after Derrick K had just called himself the best human chess player that has ever lived. But really, we do see Nehemiah putting in a lot of work to get this flip to happen, which again is already more gameplay than we saw in all of last season. Now before the elimination, we do get some great setup for it, where we do see Leia and Ayanna propping each other up, talking about being single moms. But the more emotional segment here revolved around Derrick C, where he does reveal that his sister had committed suicide right before the filming of the show. That really just makes the rest of this episode really heartbreaking. And coming into elimination, it does end up being this like really physical one of having to drag a 300-pound coffin. And like while there is a puzzle element to it, it did feel like Nehemiah and Ayanna were the clear frontrunners here just from a physical standpoint. And both of the matchups do end up going their way, but both of them do end up having pretty notable moments within them. I mean, Derrick C almost ends up catching up to Nehemiah. And again, this entire elimination is surrounded by the weight of Derrick's sister's death, and it really just makes this entire sequence here pretty emotional. But we also follow that up with Ayanna really just decimating Leia, who can't even open her lock to even start the challenge. But after Ayanna ends up finishing, she does end up helping Leia finish the challenge afterwards, which did also feel like a powerful moment here as well. So again, a really emotional set of eliminations. But after that, we do find out about the life shield twist here, which again is a fantastic addition to the game, as they are doled out to the people that win the elimination, who are obviously more likely to be on the bottom. And even if they are not, it still shakes up who's going to elimination every round, as essentially it makes it so the same person can't go into elimination back to back unless they purposely don't use the life shield on themselves. But I did also like how using the life shield takes away your right to vote, which did add an interesting layer of strategy to trying to get people to burn their life shields. Now, before moving on, we should talk about the two boots here, and we'll start off with Derrick C, who again, I did really like in his short time on this season. I did expect him to go home early, as again, he's never been someone that has done that well in the past. I mean, he was a relatively early boot on 2 of his previous 3 appearances. But again, I felt like he was fun here. He obviously has this heartbreaking story coming into this season. And while I don't know how much more he has to really offer to the show, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing him back for one more time. The other boot here was Leia, who again, I knew nothing about coming into the season, and she was fine. I mean, she kind of has this typical arc of her being a mom and wanting to prove herself, which it felt like a decent amount of people on this cast had. And while she doesn't end up doing that well here, I did feel like she had a gracious exit. But again, I don't really see much potential in her on a return from either a character or a competitive standpoint, so she's not really someone I feel like I need to see back, though I did find her likable enough to where I wouldn't be opposed to seeing her get one more shot just to see if she can make a deep run on the season. Next up, we do have episode 3, which instantly starts with a visibility spike for Ryan and Sophia that did make them seem like the obvious boots here. But their spikes in content were radically different here, where Ryan's felt a lot more lighthearted with him getting pranked by Tina, which he ends up taking in jest, and this was a fine character moment for him, while Sophia's ends up being not as fun content that mostly stemmed from her relationship with Ayanna, and we get this really bizarre segment that, I don't get if they were trying to cover it up or if they just simply didn't have the footage for it. But essentially, we hear about Sophia getting upset at Ayanna for not listening to her when doing her hair, which reminded her of when she was bullied when she was younger. So because of this, she starts freaking out. But what really makes this entire situation so much worse is how Ayanna responds to this, where she doesn't seem to care about Sophia's feelings, to where she's now upset at Sophia and now wants to target Sophia here. And this just felt really mean-spirited. Definitely not a great look for Ayanna, considering how much the show had propped her up in the previous episodes. But this does end up leading us to the daily, where they do play in teams with similar rules as the team challenges from last season, where 2 people have to volunteer as captains. I still hate that part of the format, but again, it rarely comes up, so it's not really that massive of an issue. But here, the black team is instantly noted as the stronger team, with Tina and Darrell being the captains there. The other team is led by Ryan, who volunteered himself in order to prove himself, and Ayanna, who really ends up going on a power trip here. And while their team almost makes a comeback here, they do end up losing, and Ayanna is able to save herself with the life shield here, and through that, their team has to pick another nominee, and once again, she really just takes charge and makes a decision for the team, picking Sophia, saying that she's giving her a gift by putting her in elimination. And this again just felt very mean-spirited, and even Katie gets a confessional here talking about how Ayanna's turning into an asshole. But really, again, this was a really terrible look for her. But again, to me, it felt really clear that Ryan and Sophia were the clear boots here. But this is where we start to get more content around the alliances in the game, where we do see Darrell being aligned with Janelle, MJ, and Kahada due to them being in the same room. We do also learn that he has an alliance with Derrick, and through that, Jody. But by the time of the nominations, Tina really ends up railroading over him by putting the target onto Jody for the women and putting her up against Janelle. and also ends up forcing him to put up MJ and Kahada as well. So really, Darrell ends up putting up all of his closest allies in this nomination, which obviously is terrible gameplay from his end to just let Tina run his nominations. But again, I never had much doubt about what was going to happen here. Kaia and Jody get voted in. Ryan and Sophia were to clear boots. You get this weird elimination where they race back and forth and play tic-tac-toe, and in challenge fashion, the balls that they use for the game are set on fire for whatever reason. But again, both eliminations play out as expected. But with that, let's talk about the boots here, starting with Ryan, who was fine. I've never had much of an issue with Ryan across his seasons, but I never found him that likable of a figure either. And he really is someone that I never really expect to do well on the show. I mean, he seems to be good socially to where he had people fighting for him in that last round, but he just seems to be inherently looked at as a weaker player. And I think that perception alone is already something that makes him a target coming into any given season. After that, we do have Sophia, who again is another person that coming into the season I didn't know anything about. And really, I didn't get much entertainment from her on this season. I mean, her only real content here is her relationship with Ayanna. And to me, that just felt very icky all around. And while I do feel bad for Sophia in this situation, how she got eliminated here, she really just didn't seem to be that interesting of TV. So she's someone that I'm not really that incentivized to want to see come back. Next up, we have episode 4, which was a really incredible episode and really one of the best single challenge episodes in years to me. Having pretty much everything I would want from a challenge episode. I had the gameplay, the strategy, the drama, the character moments. I mean, this episode really had it all to me. And really, the major storyline of this episode is this amazing downfall for Derrick here, who had seemingly been at the top of the game in the last few rounds, being the central figure within the majority alliance, having his alliance with the stronger men in the game in MJ, Darrell, Kahada, and Brad, while also having his alliance with Jody and other relationships throughout as well, really putting him in a very solid spot in the game, with him targeting Nehemiah. But this is where we do find out about Nehemiah's counter-alliance, with him having Latarian, Teck, Steve, and Melinda on his side. And again, it was cool to see these two sides facing off against each other, which I feel like is something we rarely see in the challenge. And we do eventually see this argument between Derrick and Nehemiah, where I love that even Darrell talks about how he doesn't know how real this rivalry is, which, again, I think it's pretty clear to pretty much everyone they were playing this up for the camera. But it still did make for some interesting TV here. Before the daily, we do get talk about the Steve and Katie relationship again. And Katie talks about how she wants to challenge herself and how she thinks that she's safe. And all this made it pretty clear to me that Katie was more than likely going home in this episode. And this all leads up to the daily, where it ends up being trivia, where if they get it wrong, they have to jump off a tall building. And instantly Katie quits, which again, sounds about right. Though again, this is hilarious considering it just came off of Katie talking about how she wanted to prove herself. But this episode does end up providing a pretty great redemption arc for Casey instead, where she had done a similar thing in previous challenges, being notable for hating heights challenges. But here she ends up winning this challenge, which was a great moment for her. For the men, Brad ends up being the first one to drop there, and Steve ends up winning that part of the challenge, which really ends up being the worst case scenario for the majority alliance, with both Steve and Casey now in power, two people who are clearly on the bottom. And now we have two of the better insulated players in the game going into elimination. And this is where we do end up having some pretty strong gameplay showing up in this episode, where Derrick talks about how he is completely safe due to having two alliance members with life shields, meaning that they're going to use them on him in the case that he's nominated. But something he didn't factor in is the fact that Steve and his alliance end up creating this plan to flush the life shields by nominating Jody and Kahada to force them to use it on themselves, which is obviously a very basic strategy. But considering this is the challenge, I mean, you do rarely see people play optimally on this show. So again, it was cool to see people play well here. Now we do see Steve going directly for Derrick here. But in the process for the female elimination, he ends up going against Katie's wishes by nominating Kendall and Ayanna, two people that Katie knew that she was going to struggle with in any given elimination, which does lead to a tiff between Steve and Katie. That was pretty fun to see as well. Now at the selection, we do get this fun moment of Ayanna taking off her clothes to reveal that she's already in her uniform. So that was fun, but she does end up getting voted in here. While the vote between Derrick and Tyler ends up being a lot closer, but Derrick does end up getting voted in as well. And considering how quiet Brad's edit was in this episode, I did feel like Derrick was just primed up to be the boot here. Afterwards, we do get this ridiculous scene of Nehemiah wanting to show his support for Brad by using Shaunae's weave as a beard to try to look like him, which, again, this was ridiculous. But this does lead to the elimination, where it is an extremely physical competition, which did seem to favor Ayanna over Katie. And unsurprisingly, Ayanna does end up winning here, but the Brad and Derrick matchup is a lot closer, but Brad ends up pulling it out. Again, creating this really great downfall for Derrick here, for him to go from the very top of the game at the beginning of the episode to him being out here. Really one of the more fun downfalls in the recent history of the show. But let's talk about the boots themselves, starting off with Katie, who again, I like Katie. I loved her on the older seasons, but I just don't feel like modern Katie brings much to the show. I didn't feel like she needed to be back on this season after her pretty much doing nothing in the first season, and I do feel like this season further proved that, where she's once again wanting to quit here and really had no potential of ever winning the season, and again, she's just not as entertaining as she used to be, so really I just found her underwhelming in every aspect. And then let's talk about Derrick, who, again, had a fantastic exit here. I mean, he was really set up as the top dog right from the premiere, and I did love seeing this Derrick-Nehemiah rivalry play out, with Nehemiah leading the charge to get him out, despite him being in the minority. Now, again, I don't love how much Derrick was clearly playing it up for the camera, and really, I don't find Derrick to be that interesting of a TV character in his own right, but considering he is a strong competitor, and considering how this Derrick-Nehemiah rivalry could continue for future seasons, I do think he is a perfect fit for the All-Star series moving forward. Now let's talk about episode 5, which instantly starts with a bevy of content around Melinda, with her getting strong personal content, talking about her losing her daughter and again wanting to find herself. All really strong content for her here. We also get more insight into Nehemiah's alliance, with this setting up that him, Teck, and Latarian are the core 3, and that Steve is their 4th, which is an alliance breakdown that does end up playing a factor moving forward. We do also get a lot of content from Tina, with her talking about how she isn't an angry person anymore, and how she's changed from older seasons, which, I mean, I guess. But this really plays into her arc in this episode as well. We then get to the daily, which ends up being an individual challenge where Teck gets a lot of focus, and he does pretty well initially, only to waste time with the math section, causing him to get pissed. But this is where we do get the setup that Ayanna wants to save him with her life shield, which ends up not going through, ironically due to the play that Teck's alliance utilized in the last round being used against them here. We do end up seeing Steve lose for the men, which was kind of surprising to see, as I did feel like he had a good strategy from the get-go of trying to knock down 2 pieces at once. Though due to the rule that you can only bring one back at a time, by the time he went back for that second piece, ended up floating off far enough to where he ends up losing time because of how far it floated away, which is definitely not something I personally would have accounted for there, but I did like how strategic Steve seemed to be in most of these sort of scenarios. As for the women, both Casey and Melinda end up not finishing, with Casey just outright quitting, which kind of undoes her arc from the previous episode, and also does earn her the ire of TJ, while Melinda ends up getting injured and can't continue, but since she did less than Casey, she is the one that instantly goes into elimination. Now along the way, Jasmine ends up having similar issues to Casey and Melinda, but ends up finishing anyway, which ends up providing her a lot of positive content. But kind of unceremoniously, Darrell and Jody end up being the winners of the challenge here, really setting up the Tina-Jody rivalry once again, and unsurprisingly, Tina does get voted in here. But along the way, we do see Darrell, Brad, and Jody really solidify their alliance, making it clear that they are set to target Nehemiah's alliance, with them targeting Teck here, while also forcing Ayanna to play the life shield on herself. And along the way, Steve also ends up going into self-preservation mode here and tries to throw Teck under the bus, which ends up turning his entire alliance against him. And while I do think this is bad play on Steve for openly turning against his close allies, I do also think it's dumb that Nehemiah, Teck, and Latarian are so butthurt over the fact that he did this, considering, again, he was on the bottom of their alliance anyway. And either way, Teck was getting voted in, even if Steve hadn't done that. But Teck and Tina end up getting voted in here, and Tina does have a fun final hurrah here with her banging pots and pans and calling out Jody. But coming to elimination, we do end up with Teck beating Steve in what is a pretty solid matchup. But when it is Tina and Melinda's time to go, Tina ends up essentially quitting, which, is what you would expect from Tina. But through this, TJ ends up getting annoyed with her, again, as TJ does. But I do feel like this is a mostly underwhelming way for Tina to go out here. That does kind of lessen the impact of the end of the episode here. But with that, let's talk about the boots, starting off with Steve, who again, I knew nothing about him coming into the season, but I did find him to be pretty likable here. I did like his strategic approach to the game here, where he seemed to be one of the more active strategic thinkers on this season, where despite him not being the greatest physical competitor, and also coming into this season with almost no relationships, I do feel like he did solid work considering what he had to work with. Obviously, he's the one that execute on the Derrick boot, which is one of, if not the best move made on this season. So again, I personally really liked his appearance here and wouldn't be opposed to seeing him play again. The other boot here was Tina, who again, is still an incredible character all these years later. To me, she was the biggest get for this cast, and in terms of TV, I do think she delivered. And I don't love that she ends up quitting here, but it was really great just to see her back. She still gives great confessionals. I do like the dynamic between her and TJ, where TJ constantly mocks her throughout the season. And while I do have hesitancies over her potentially coming back from a competition standpoint, considering how prone she is to wanting to quit the game, I'm sure for whenever she's back on the show, she will provide fun TV, as I just feel like she's a naturally entertaining character. Now for episode 6, where right away we do see a lot from Tyler, who feels like he is in danger, with him also getting the setup of his relationship with Janelle, who finally gets screen time for the first time since the premiere. Again, it did very much feel like Tyler was going to be the major character of the episode. We also see Kendall get content for the first time this season, really, with her talking to her kids, which did seem like a bad sign for her as well. Jasmine also ends up getting positive content here, with Janelle talking about how surprised she is at how good Jasmine's doing on the season, which again, finally really props her up here right before she kind of gets thrown under the bus coming into the daily. Where here the players do end up having to pair up, and Jasmine ends up being the last one picked along with Tyler, who are essentially forced to pair up here. And they do end up struggling at the puzzle and end up being sent into elimination, largely due to how slow Jasmine ends up being here. So again, I did find it funny how up and down Jasmine's edit was in this episode. But through this daily, TJ does announce that the pairs that do end up coming together here end up being the pairs for the rest of the season, which is something that I did like, how if they are going to do this twist of having pairs for the rest of the season, that the players got to pick those pairs themselves, and this did lead to some interesting pairs with many of them having history beforehand. But Brad and Jody really get propped up as the strongest pair here, and they proceed to win the daily and do end up targeting the King's Palace Alliance, but due to Teck and Melinda having life shields and them now protecting their duos, that means that the only King's Palace member vulnerable is Latarian and his partner Kendall, who also during the daily ends up getting injured, which later ends up DQing her before the elimination. Now supposedly what really happened here is that Kendall ended up getting COVID during filming from a production member that had broken protocol, and this is really just the show like covering it up, which also leads credence to the fact that I really feel like MTV should get their COVID protocols sorted, considering supposedly a similar thing happened on Spies, Lies, and Allies. But either way, it was disappointing to see her go here from that. But through that, Jasmine ends up being safe, despite being a major factor in why her and Tyler are going to elimination to begin with, meaning that now Tyler and Latarian have to face off in what ends up being pole wrestle, the same elimination Latarian won against Ace last season, and he ends up dominating here as well, impressively tossing Tyler around, eliminating him here, which was a bit of an upset considering I did think of Tyler as one of the strongest competitors coming into this season, and Latarian ends up just beating him pretty handily here. Before moving on, let's talk about the boots, starting with Kendall, who essentially gets purpled on this season up to this episode, and now considering the medevac, it does make full sense. Now that it seemed like she had that much going on and had that much of an impact on the season beforehand, but it was underwhelming to see her go out that way without her making much of an impression after having a really strong season last time. So because I wouldn't be opposed to seeing her back, considering how the season was mostly just a wash. As for the other boot in Tyler, who again I thought was an interesting person to see back here. I mean, he was obviously a really strong competitor back in the day of Cutthroat and Rivals, and it would have been interesting to see him back on seasons after that. But to see him on All-Stars here, again, he was fine. He was another figure that didn't get that much screen time until his boot episode here, but I did feel like he had a strong exit. He didn't seem to be in the greatest shape in the world, especially in comparison to what he used to be, but I do feel like he feels like a perfect casting choice for All-Stars, considering what he ends up bringing to the show. Now for episode 7, which starts off with a really bizarre segment of the King's Palace celebrating once again, but this time with them jumping up and down, chanting, which is like just really bizarre to see a whole bunch of 40-year-olds doing this. But it was fun to see the cuts to the other players who were clearly just annoyed at them the entire time. But also I did find it weird to see them just abruptly mention that, hey, now Jasmine and Ayanna are now in our alliance, which obviously makes sense due to them being partnered with the core members of the King's Palace. But I did find it humorous how abruptly this is mentioned in the episode. But through this, we do get more talk from Brad about his relationship with Nehemiah, and clearly that was going to be a major storyline on this episode, especially once Brad and Jody once again win the daily, and with Teck and Ayanna losing the challenge and Jasmine and Latarian having the life shield, Brad's only option from the opposing alliance here is to target Nehemiah, and this does lead to some more awkward scenes between them. We also have Melinda getting upset at Janelle for wanting to vote her in, and we hear Nehemiah getting upset that Brad put him up after he put on the beard to support Brad during the Derrick elimination, which was just kind of weird. All this to me was a pretty bad look. Again, it did feel like they were being pretty poor sports here, being really incredulous that they're being targeted despite them being the heads of the opposite alliance. We also get this awkward scene of the players eating out at a restaurant where both alliances are sitting at their individual tables, and Nehemiah and Latarian are just openly talking about how pissed they are at the other side, which again is all pretty poor play here, really just isolating them and creating a further division between alliances. We do end up having Nehemiah and Melinda being voted in and have the face-off against their allies in Teck and Ayanna, only for the elimination to be cancelled. As along the way with this episode, we have also seen a lot from Casey, where we found out that she's pregnant, and because of that, she gets DQ'd at the end of the episode, along with Kaia, which again, this also shows how irresponsible MTV has been with not doing pregnancy tests before the season. Where almost every recent season of the challenge has had an incident of this, where someone goes onto the season not knowing that they're pregnant, and they usually end up just shoving it under the rug, but here they actually do show it, which was interesting, and it was pretty heartwarming to see like Casey and her fiance finding out, and also her like revealing it to the cast is fun. But again, I still think it's irresponsible MTV to not be doing pregnancy tests before the season, and also once they are on the season have to kick them out once they are pregnant due to liability issues. But with that, let's talk about the boots. First, talking about Casey, who I really liked on this season. I mean, I'd actually just before her boot episode here just rewatched Fresh Meat, which really reminded me how great of a character she was there. And again, she was great here as well. I did like seeing an older and more mature Casey on the challenge. And while I don't ever see her winning a season, I did find her to be a really likable presence here. I wouldn't be opposed to seeing her play out a full game down the road. And now let's talk about her partner in Kaia, who I really feel for here. I mean, Kaia has always been one of the more likable figures on the challenge to me, and he was more of the same here. I mean, it does suck to see him have one of his best seasons he's had, and for it to be cut short due to something completely out of his control, but I do feel like he is a perfect fit for All-Stars. I mean, someone that is a strong competitor and can bring some great TV through his confessionals, and also I feel like he has a much better chance of doing well here, where he was so close to getting to a final here with Casey as his partner. So I do hope to see him again, where I do think he would have a good shot of making a final, and possibly with the right partner, win the season. So he's definitely someone I would like to see back. Now for episode 8, which once again starts with the King's Palace celebrating, and during this they end up kicking out Janelle from the room. And while this was poor social play, I do think the show kind of portrays this to be a bit more serious than what it really seemed to be, where Nehemiah clearly seemed to be doing this in a bit of a joking way. But we end up seeing this conversation with Janelle afterwards of her complaining about it to Janelle, and Janelle genuinely getting upset. Afterwards, we do get a lot of focus on the MJ-Janae partnership, with us getting a lot of positive content for Janae, with her talking about how much she's grown over the years, and MJ talking about how great of a political player she is. We hear about how supportive of a partner MJ is, and unsurprisingly, this is followed by them winning the daily. And really just overall felt like the start of their arc of how strong their partnership ends up being, leading to the end of the season. And all of this is while Brad and Jody end up having a pretty poor showing at the daily, where for the first time, Jody ends up messing up largely during the memorization portion of the puzzle, which ends up being her biggest misstep on the season up to this point. But also we do see Jasmine, unsurprisingly, sucking at the challenge as well, causing her and Latarian to end up losing. But also through this episode, we do get a lot of negativity surrounding Ayanna, with her accusing Latarian of cheating off their puzzle, really pissing off her own alliance member there for no reason. We also get this big controversy over Jody's missing Greek salad that was really bizarre, especially where Ayanna ends up taunting Jody over this after she reveals that she ate it. And what is a really awkward scene. I mean, this also leads to a fight between Ayanna and Jasmine. That was kind of fun. But all of this was just kind of weird. But back to the game, we do see Janae and MJ consider making a move here against Brad and Jody, but decide to hold back due to the uncertainty of how many rounds are left in the game. So with that, they end up doing the obvious noms here of the two King's Palace teams that are eligible, and while we do get the red herring of Teck and Ayanna possibly being voted in due to Ayanna's abrasiveness, Nehemiah and Melinda do get voted in as the bigger threats here, and coming into elimination, we do find out that the winner of this elimination will receive the final life shield and in turn automatically go to the final. And while the challenge here was on an equal playing field here, with it being more communication and puzzle based, with there not being much physicality to it, Nehemiah and Melinda still end up winning over Latarian and Jasmine, giving Melinda her first ever final appearance and making this one of Nehemiah's strongest showings. Before moving on, let's talk about the boots, starting with Jasmine, who was fine here. I mean, I do like Jasmine as a character, and I do feel like it was humorous to see her now be this more mellow presence on this season, at least up until her boot episode here, where she does get into that fight with Ayanna. But again, I do find her to be likable, but she's just a terrible competitor and really someone that I can't imagine seeing on the show. But again, I do at least give her credit for trying, and she does seem to have a lot of heart, which I guess means something. Also, let's talk about Latarian, who I do feel for on this season, with him being initially paired up with Kendall, who again would have been a decent partner for him, and him getting kind of screwed over by being forced to pair up with Jasmine afterwards, one of the worst competitors, not even just on this season, but probably in the history of the challenge, and really just gets kind of screwed there, which is a shame because, again, I think he is a solid competitor, especially in overtly physical eliminations. I think if he just gets a decent partner, he could do very well, but he ends up never having a fair shake on this or last season, where both times he was paired up with a pretty weak partner in the elimination that leads to him going home. And because that, again, I would like to see him back. I would like to see him get to a final and see what he really is able to do there, but again, that'll have to be for some point down the road. Now for episode 9, which started off with a really heavy-handed opening that pretty much just outlined the entire episode, with us starting with Brad talking about how recently he has missed out on getting to the end, and with Jody also getting content about how she needs to prove that she can still do it. This really did seem to play into their eventual downfall in this episode. Janelle talks about having an injured back, which ends up being a source of conflict between her and Darrell, with her talking about possibly quitting due to it. But here we also get content from Nehemiah talking about Darrell being the biggest threat in a final, which again really leads into them getting voted in later on. We also see Janae and MJ talk about the possibility of never going into elimination, which the edit really props up this notion here, and while they are the only ones to eventually not go in to elimination on this season, I do find it weird how much the edit props this up, particularly from Janae's end, whose winner edit really skyrockets in this episode, with her getting so much positive content, being shown to have influence on Ayanna and Nehemiah and keeping them safe. Also, she does the best out of the women in the daily, which really gets highlighted as well. I felt like that was some pretty clear foreshadowing here. We do also end up having a really dumb daily that the show really hypes up as, oh, the first challenge to require 3 semi-trucks, which, like, who cares? But I did find it humorous that only Nehemiah and Melinda are able to finish it here, but through that they are able to save Teck and Ayanna, and with Brad and Jody having lost the challenge due to Brad having broken all of the boxes instead of untying them, which again also seemed kind of ridiculous, this did make it pretty clear that Darrell and Janelle were going to be voted in. Again, with Janelle getting a lot of credit for keeping her and MJ safe here, leading us to a really strange elimination of them having to destroy this room, and the team that collected the most rubble at the end ends up winning, and ends up being really close here, but Janelle and Darrell end up pulling it out. And again, I did feel for Brad and Jody here, for them to be going home here in this position where they seemed like a shoo-in to win the final if they made it there, but again, of how much the show really propped that notion up, I really just didn't think it was actually going to happen. But with that, let's talk about the boots here, starting with Jody, who did have a great return here to the challenge, really showing that she is still a top tier competitor all these years later. Though I will say that I feel like she still has a lot of the same flaws as she had in her older seasons. She does have a tendency to freak out whenever something doesn't go her way, and see her get really flustered, and that did seem to harm her here as well. But again, she does win a bevy of dailies here. She wins her first elimination, so overall this was a pretty great season for her, and I think she has a lot of potential to win another season moving forward. And then we have Brad, who gave us more of what to expect from him. I mean, as a character, I do find Brad to be pretty hit or miss, and here he was just kind of fine. I mean, he does end up being overshadowed in the edit by people like Jody and Nehemiah, and while he isn't the most riveting character, he is still a solid challenge competitor, and one that I do think is the perfect caliber of competitor to be a mainstay here on All Stars, and I do think he is another one that has a strong season in him moving forward, and definitely one I can see winning one of these down the road. And now let's talk about the finale, which entirely comprised of the final, which was fine. Again, I do find the finals mostly boring, though here it did provide for some pretty fun moments. But again, for the most part, it was really just fine. I mean, we start off with this sleeper stand phase that happens in most modern finals, but here in particular, it did feel really pointless considering it happens at the beginning of the final, where in most other finals it happens in the middle. Here it just felt like pointless and just felt like a way for them to mess with the players. Then we get to phase 1, which ended up just leading up to a purge, which I did find really underwhelming considering this was a bulk of the final. And for most of it to just not matter outside of who gets 4th place just felt really strange to me. Where it would have made more sense if time advantages were handed out to people in phase 2 based on their times here, but instead we just end up seeing Teck and Ayanna end up quitting here. And despite Nehemiah and Melinda and Darrell and Janelle end up being out in front in 1st and 2nd place respectively, they end up getting no advantage for that, while Janelle and MJ, who were clearly in last here, don't get any sort of disadvantage for that, which leads us to phase 2, where we do start off with the eating challenge, which is really just disgusting to see considering MJ was just puking everything up, and it's like, do we really have to see that? But Darrell and Janelle end up coming out of this in front. But the entire final ends up really just coming down to these math equations that end up giving you a combination to a lock that all the teams seem to struggle with, despite the instructions to how to open the lock are literally right next to them. But unsurprisingly to me, Janelle wins the final here, along with MJ, who is there as well, which I really found it strange how, despite MJ getting some content pretty early on in the episode about him wanting to win for his family, the episode really does focus around Janelle, with MJ barely getting time to speak at the end of the episode here. I did also find it really awkward how the episode ends with Janelle and MJ getting on this plane with TJ for no real explained reason, as again, they don't go anywhere, so I just found it bizarre and found it a weird way to end the season. And really, MJ and Janelle here are very satisfying winners to me. I really like the both of them. However, I also do feel like from a competitive standpoint, it did kind of underwhelm me considering they were never in the lead throughout the entire final up until that very end section, to where they massively get helped out by the fact that Teck and Ayanna quit, and them having no disadvantage for coming in last place on the first leg of the final there. Before wrapping up here, let's talk about the finalists, starting off with Ayanna, who is clearly one of the bigger characters of the season, being a major focal point of all the drama on this season. And now having watched her original seasons as well, I really don't feel like she's changed that much since those seasons, really bringing the same type of content on the return here, which at points can be pretty icky, but is also sometimes pretty fun. So really she ends up being a pretty complex figure for the show here, and ended up being a better competitor than I was expecting her, despite her end up quitting here at the very end. Next up, we have Teck, who I was pleasantly surprised by him competitively on this season, where after season 1, I was expecting him to be a fun character, but someone that always goes home early every time he's on the show. But here he did seem to do pretty well throughout the season, and then even in the final here, he was doing okay, only to be slowed down by Ayanna at the end. And I do feel like he is someone that probably has more to give in a future season, and is someone that I hope to see get another chance. Next up, we do have Melinda, who was another pleasant surprise here after having nothing but mediocre runs on the main show throughout her numerous appearances beforehand. But here she ends up making it to the final, and while she does have this generic arc of wanting to prove to herself that she still has it, I do feel like she gets the most developed arc over the course of this season. And it was nice to see her turn into a competent competitor here. Next up, we have Nehemiah, who seemed to be a major source of controversy on this season, with him getting a very mixed reception from the fan base, with him being someone that is clearly hamming it up for the camera, making him feel inauthentic in his confessionals, but I still personally feel like he made for good TV, and I do feel like he's probably one of the better competitors of the season here. I mean, this is probably his best season from a competitive and political standpoint. And he's someone that I do think has a lot of potential to do very well in future seasons. Next up, we do have Janelle, who I was pretty excited to see come back here, and I did end up just being kind of underwhelmed by her as a character, where she just seemed kind of boring. But she did prove that she is still a strong competitor here, still doing well despite having injured back along the way. But I really just don't know how much she would really bring as a TV character on return. Next up, we have Darrell, who ends up coming in second place once again, and really he just brings the same amount of content to the show here once again. Again, he's still a likable figure for the show. He's still someone that brings some great one-liners here and there. He's still a great competitor, especially for an All-Stars series here, and he is, to me, again, the perfect caliber of competitor to bring to the show. Though realistically, again, I feel like we've seen what we're going to get from Darrell. And while I wouldn't be opposed to seeing him return, I also don't know if it's an absolute necessity outside of building to the caliber of the cast. And now let's talk about the winners, starting with Janelle, who I've always really liked as a figure for the show, and I'm really happy to see her finally get a win here, especially after being skeptical of why she was even coming back here after a really solid redemption arc in the first season, and me thinking that her story was done. But instead she ends up outdoing herself here, which surprisingly ended up bolstering the arcs that she had on last season, and clearly making her one of the better players in the All-Star series here, with her being tied for the top woman from last season, now winning this season. She really had a couple of really solid seasons here, back to back. And finally, let's talk about MJ, who I've always really liked as well and was happy to see him win as well. But again, I'm just really puzzled by his edit on this season, where despite him being part of this winning pair, it really did feel like Janelle got so much more of the content of the pair than MJ here, who just seemed like kind of an afterthought in the edit. But he's still, again, a strong competitor and someone that I feel like is a perfect fit for All-Stars moving forward. Definitely someone I would like to see back, and someone that I feel like could bring pretty good TV moving forward if he's shown on the show. But with that, I mean, that really is the season of the Challenge All-Stars 2, which was a really solid season of the show to me. While I do feel like the season peaked at the Derrick K elimination, I do feel like it was still a strong season overall, still having the original vibe of that first All-Star season, but with the game being more strategic and there being this really clear division in the alliances. We get more drama and more notable moments along the way. So for me, this was a massive improvement from the first season in pretty much every conceivable way. It really makes this one of my favorite recent seasons of the show. And also really just makes me excited to see what's to come for season 3, which based off of the leaked cast seems like it's going to be incredible. And I'll obviously be doing a review of that once that season comes out. I'm also still in the process of rewatching the challenge seasons, so I can eventually get around to doing a season ranking, hopefully sometime in the near future, hopefully before the challenge 38. So stay tuned for that as well. But for now, that is my review of the Challenge All-Stars Season 2. Thank you for watching.